This is Scott Becker with the Becker Private Equity Podcast. We join you regularly with the intent to have people learn something as well as be entertained some. We visit with brilliant private equity and business leaders. We're joined today by Amber Walsh, part of the executive team at McGuireWoods, also the long-term counsel of the Physician Hospital Association of America, now called Physician-Led Healthcare. She works at the intersection of sort of healthcare and private equity. We're going to talk today about some of the shortages, some of the problems facing healthcare and how they impact private equity. Amber, why don't I tee it up, ask you to start, tell us what you're seeing out there, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, I'm particularly interested this morning thinking a lot about the physician shortage. And this topic gets a lot of attention. Scott, I know this is something that you think and speak about a lot yourself, but there's two angles to this physician shortage crisis, really. And just to set the stage a little bit on that, expected to have that shortage to grow up to, and of course, different figures will tell you different things, up to 125,000 physicians short over the next 12 years, with a particular shortage in primary care and certain specialties. What I'm really interested in and have been thinking a lot about lately is the impact on rural communities. Obviously, I'm not alone in this. This has been getting a lot of attention, frankly, for generations. But that the rural impact and how acute it is in rural communities, but also some of the really neat programs that are being developed to target this shortage in rural communities, some controversial, some not. That's really what I'm watching right now.
No, and it's fascinating. The numbers that I see in the physician shortage are much more daunting than 120,000 or 100,000 over like 12 years. We see it in a ton of communities now. There are certain areas, like somebody needs a neurologist, even as populated as the city of Chicago, it's hard to find a neurologist. There's places in Texas, there's one neurologist for 500,000 people. Similarly, Minnesota, one dermatologist in one area for 500,000 people. And those are areas with everybody's got growing regions of the country have dementia issues, skin cancer issues, et cetera, and just daunting shortages in a lot of different specialties and in primary care. And talk about some of the newer, innovative ways to try and deal with that and what you're seeing and what you're thinking.
Yeah, so just to set the stage on the rural component of that, so 20% of Americans live in rural communities, but only 10% of physicians practice there. And it's exacerbated by the fact that only 2% of physician residency training programs occur in rural communities. And that has two impacts. One is that when you don't have residency programs in rural communities, you are less likely to attract and keep physicians to those communities. It also means that these residency programs, because they don't take place in those communities, aren't addressing the particular needs of a rural population. We all know that population health varies dramatically around the country, different parts of the country, depending on what they're exposed to, urban versus rural, et cetera. And what I'm seeing is an increased focus on shifting that. But it can be a little bit controversial because the programs that are focused on shifting physician resources from more urban and suburban communities to rural communities, those are important to the rural communities, but they don't grow the overall pie. You're just moving physicians around. What I'm really intrigued by are the programs that are geared towards making new physicians and making it more attractive to become a physician, more attainable to become a physician. And I'm really interested in this, especially because you and I have talked a lot about the age of our children and them making choices and how they learn about different opportunities. I love the programs that a lot of rural-oriented health systems are doing, these grow your own programs where they are taking and supporting junior high school students, giving them exposure to healthcare opportunities subsidizing them through scholarships, of course, typically with the commitment to come back to their own community and serve. I love those programs. And I'm also really loving watching the development of the Rural Residency Planning and Development arm of HHS that is funding new residency programs. Bipartisan support, of course, this is not a super controversial issue, but funding new residency programs in rural communities, but with an emphasis on building those residency programs from the scratch and that kind of de novo grassroots growth. It's not just moving physicians from an urban community to a rural community. There's lots of programs like that. And then, of course, you have all of the additional elements of greater support for telehealth, greater support for technology that allows the physicians that we do have in this shortage crisis to extend themselves a little bit more. So you have these kind of legislative and regulatory solutions that don't create more physicians, but they do allow the physicians we have to serve a broader community. I love all of those types of programs, and there are many, many of them, but those are the ones that really intrigue me.
Thank you. No, and it's so interesting to see sort of the targeted efforts to solve some of this. We know as a nation, we're short of residency programs. 50,000 people apply to med school today, 20,000 a year get in or so. There's only about 18,000 residency spots, and we're retiring more than 18,000 doctors a year. So we know we've got challenges there. And you've got this complicated problem because as the world has changed, 20% of people live in rural communities. That's probably down significantly over the last 10, 20, 30 years. More and more a physician and her husband, a physician and his wife, they have no desire to live any place but the top 10 largest communities in the country. So in Chicago recently, a physician colleague was having trouble finding a job. That physician would move 50 miles away and would have 10 job offers. And it really is this challenging balance, but we're such a free society. We can't force physicians to go one place versus another, but it really does become, how do we systematically develop residency programs and other things in some of these communities so people get comfortable? This can be a great lifestyle, great place to live, and so forth. But it is a really challenging issue, just given the overall shortages in so many specialties of primary care, plus the allocation of where physicians go. And in a very free society, it's very hard to tell somebody differently. So what you're talking about is incentive programs. If you go to this area, that area, and do primary care or do something else, you'll get your loans released or something of that sort. But what a challenging situation when you start with entirely, in general, a shortage of supply, and then try and fill out that supply in different places where there's demand but not enough supply. What a challenge.
The interesting thing, too, is this physician shortage is the backdrop to so many other policy and political issues in healthcare. So, for this audience, the private equity investor, and there's this great debate about the importance or problem or, salvation of private equity, depending on your perspective, in healthcare. And the physician shortage is part of that conversation. Is, the private equity community very much believes that they can have a positive impact on that shortage by reducing some of the strain that those physicians experience that often cause them to retire a little bit earlier than they might. It just is this constant overlay. It also comes up in other political debates about the scope of practice of non-physician, but very important healthcare providers, nurse practitioners, all of your allied health community that argues that they can fill that gap by extending their own scope of medicine without physician supervision. It's very interesting because it's not an issue that just appears in a vacuum, that you just have to solve that. It's that interlay and that connectivity to so many other issues in healthcare.
No, it's so true. The scope of practice issue, a constantly evolving issue. I remember when anesthesiologists hated CRNAs. Now they often need them because you can't even get things done, or surgical sites or health system sites staff without the CRNAs too. And you're right. The shortage leads to hospitals having to pay more money, retain and grow a physician vertically integrated system. It leads to private equity funds having a harder time growing out organic growth and growing out platforms. Amber, yeah, I want to thank you so much for joining us on the Becker Private Equity and Business Podcast. It's always fantastic to visit with Amber Walsh, one of the very brightest in the business. Amber, thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Scott.